Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this college football playoff edition of the Orange Crush podcast. My name is Grayson Mann alongside my co-host David Hood. And today, we couldn't do this Clemson Texas preview without some reinforcements. And we brought in Eric Henry of Horns247. Eric, welcome to the podcast, man. We're excited for this podcast's first CFP preview.
I appreciate you guys having me on.
Eric, one of the fascinating things about this matchup is you don't get to see this often. There's a Clemson versus Texas brawl in Austin. One of the unique things about this playoff format is you're going to get a home game in Austin, Texas. What are you just basic general reaction to seeing the Tigers on the bracket? What has these last couple weeks been like?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, first, I'll kind of start just, with Steve Sarkisian. Steve is someone who routinely talked about just being an overall fan of college football. And he noted kind of the unique nature of this, right? Kind of a non-conference matchup, something that you'd only see in the early part of the year, right? Or if it's a rivalry game, something like a Florida State, Florida, or, a Clemson, South Carolina, right? But in this case, you get it here in the college football playoff, and that is certainly unique, right? I think the one and done aspect of it, of course, the first round being, at home teams or the higher seed site. That's something I think is pretty unique as well, right? Just kind of and it's something, Grayson and David, I was curious of how would this look? What would this look from just a logistics standpoint, right? Does Texas get to, get their whole, bells and whistles as far as their entrance? What does Clemson get? It seems from what we've heard, it's going to operate just like a Texas home game, except the only notable exception is that Clemson will get their entrance video played. But outside of that, I'm really interested to kind of just see how this thing shakes out. And I think the other part of your question, you asked what the reaction was. The majority of the reaction is from the Texas team is the Andrew Makuba Bowl. That's I know Dabo Swinney's talked about it. It certainly was a talking point from Texas, and we just dealt with Texas media availability today. Andrew Makuba talked about it as well. Nothing but complimentary those guys in his time at Clemson under Dabo Swinney. So certainly plenty of storylines heading into Saturday.
I think one of the more interesting storylines for me, this is my 7th college football playoff, but it's weird because, usually you have that break that we were talking about off camera a minute ago. You have that time. And Dabo Swinney likes to have what he calls JV time during practices where the guys that redshirted or maybe didn't play a lot during the year, they get to come in and practice and they get significant reps. You just don't have that. And the loser on December the 21st, the loser, that's it. Your season's over. No more practices. 10, 12 days before a lot of other teams with worse records are going to play. It's just interesting to me, just the fact that is just it, man. Cold turkey. And I told Grayson earlier today that maybe need to change this. This really isn't the college football playoff. This is a play-in game to the college football playoff. This is, let's get rid of the bottom 4, get rid of 4, and then we'll have the final 4 when they decided to kind of impose a penalty on themselves after having a brawl with South Carolina really early to say, hey, before Christmas, the season's over.
David, real quick, I don't know if that was on my end or your end. Your question came in a little bit choppy. What I caught, just kind of run it back to you. I caught the tail end of you talking about the fact that because of the way that the structure of the college football playoff is, some of the extra practices you don't get. And then I caught what you just said with the brawl. So I think I missed the meat of your question.
Yeah, well, it's just that's it. Your season's over. December 21st. No more practices, no bowl practice, no bowl gifts, no bowl swag, no trip to a bowl site. Boom, you're done.
Yeah, it's – I'll say this. Let me start with Steve Sarkisian probably has a bigger beef with – in terms of the calendar, the transfer portal window falling directly in these things. And he was upfront and adamant about it, saying, hey, you don't see, imagine if, the NFL playoffs started and all of a sudden all the players became free agents, right? Like that was what he said today. So he probably has more of a gripe with that than anything else. But to your point, I do think it is interesting in the sense that, I can't speak for Clemson. You guys are more equipped to speak that than I am. Steve has been someone who, outside of what I mentioned with the transfer portal window, he's more or less been someone who's just said, hey, the schedule's the schedule. I will deal with it. When they change it, you guys let me know. But I do think deep down in his heart of hearts, he would like to find time for some of that development. In the past, and I've been on the beat, this is my second year. Last year, he really hammered it home talking about it during the bye week. This year, he talked about it being in the SEC, having 2 bye weeks, and especially that second bye week, wanting to find ways to create more depth across his roster, because you're going to go, or you're facing the possibility of going 17 weeks, 17 games, right? So in that sense, I would say not even from, maybe the aspect that Dabo Swinney talks about as far as developing some of the guys who haven't played, just if you're going to go 17 games, you're going to need more guys than you would in the past, right? And maybe some of that depth or some of those reps, would have been created for some of those bowl practices, right? That maybe you get some guys, some reps, some looks for the future. But in this playoff structure, I think it's just as crucial, to Steve's point, to create that depth because, hey, Texas has been banged up, especially in the early part of the year. They need more guys to step up in the rotation. And I'm sure we'll get to it. Even look at like a Kelvin Banks, right? He went down. They had to lean on a redshirt freshman and Trevor Gooseby to step in 7 plays in the Texas A&M game. Now it looks like Kelvin will be back. But to that point, yeah, I think it's crucial to find ways to maybe build in some more practice time so you can just get more depth across the board.
Yeah, one of the areas for Clemson right now, they're facing some depth issues as running back, where your second string back tears his ACL in the ACC championship game. But Eric, one of the more fascinating things, I asked Dabo Swinney and other members of our beat, asked Wes Goodwin, the defensive coordinator, about the use of Arch Manning within this matchup in particular. So that just really he's been a hot topic since he took over for Ewers in that mid part of this season and played pretty well in relief of Ewers there in that part. Just what has Sarkisian maybe alluded to on the use of Manning? Because it's been interesting to see him being thrown in certain packages, like he scored a touchdown in Aggieland against Texas A&M. Just maybe with the ability that Manning has and the struggles, we'll be pretty frank here, that Clemson's had against mobile quarterbacks in the last couple of weeks. Is there maybe more thought to saying, hey, we need to throw Arch out there and see if he can give us a look that Ewers just can't with his legs?
Grayson, I'm going to answer that question, but I think the best way to kind of paint the picture for your audience is to start from the beginning of the year, right? So Steve Sarkisian has been adamant really since the 2023 spring practice when Quinn Ewers, so I've been Arch's first spring, that Quinn was the guy. Quinn kind of shut the door and there wasn't going to be, as far as a quarterback controversy, anything like that, right? And that was the case last year. And more or less was the case this year up until Quinn Ewers' injury. We're talking about his first injury that was suffered against the UTSA. When that injury occurred and Arch Manning came and performed the way he did, then, of course, it opened the door for some of the questions. All right, what do you do with Arch? How do you utilize him? So on and so forth. Steve Sarkisian was asked by us in the local media the Thursday prior to the Georgia game. It was the first question he was asked. What would it take to kind of make a move and insert Arch Manning? And Steve just vehemently shut down the question. Said, I don't know what type of question that is. Next question. Well, as timing would have it, what would it take? I guess it would take the type of first quarter or first quarter and a half that Quinn Ewers put forth against Georgia, because then he made the switch. Steve Sarkisian had never pulled Quinn Ewers in a game outside of injury up until that game. And then we saw what happened there. Now, that wasn't Arch's best performance either. I mean, that was just Georgia's day, right? But then you move forward and Quinn Ewers doesn't necessarily play as well as he performed prior to the injury. And then, Steve Sarkisian is asked, and I'm not out to make Steve look like a hypocrite. It's just his own words here. Steve was asked, well, do you think there could be some packages for Arch as far as his legs? And Steve said, hey, we're not really a running QB type of team, right? Like we like to use our running backs, so on and so forth. And then Quinn Ewers ends up with an ankle injury the week prior to A&M, and then all of a sudden there's the Arch Manning package, right? And then Steve says, well, it looked like there just was some opportunities there to use Arch's legs, so on and so forth. based on the fact that, we're going to face a mobile, he's not a mobile, excuse me. We're going to face a really talented Texas A&M, front four, and we want to utilize Arch's legs, right? Okay. So now you see it's kind of been this snowball effect. And now it kind of has landed at this place where Steve said entering the Georgia game, we're going to the Georgia game for the audience, the SEC title game, I should say, the second matchup. And Steve said, well, I think we're going to use some plays on Saturday I think you haven't seen before. And what you saw was an Arch Manning package. I say all that to say, yes, I do think at this point, it would not be out of bounds to expect an Arch Manning package on Saturday, just because, circumstances have allowed for such in Texas offense.
I have to tell this story about Arch Manning. He came to Dabo Swinney's high school camp when his recruitment was still going on, and they started doing some 7-on-7s, and he threw, out of all of the years that I've covered Dabo's high school camp, maybe the prettiest pass from just over midfield, threw it on a dime into the end zone. It was the prettiest ball I've ever seen. And, what makes it more, notable or unique is the person on the other end of that pass is Mateo Uiagalelei, now the big defensive lineman at Oregon, who was playing tight end that day. But I go back and I go, man, Mateo and Arch put together one of the prettiest passes I've ever seen. It was absolutely gorgeous. You could tell then that he had talent. Now, Clemson is probably good. They're going to prepare for both. They have prepared for both. But this is a Texas team, when I go back and when I watch and when I look at them, man, they have that two-headed, monster back there with Wisner and Jedon Blue, who I love, man. I think Blue, if you can get him on the edge, get him in a little bit of space, that cat is dangerous, but they still want to go over the top. How would you kind of describe how that offense has evolved over the year?
This has been a really interesting thing to watch. When CJ Baxter went down in fall camp, I guess I should, before I even mention CJ's injury, when you bring in the amount of receivers that Texas did over the offseason, Isaiah Bond from Alabama, Matt Golden from Houston, Silas Bolden from Oregon State, you get Ryan Wingo, a top 2, top 3 receiver recruit, right? The shift of the offense, the nature of the offense eventually was going to evolve, right? In 2023 and even years prior, Steve Sarkisian had a notoriously tight receiver rotation. It was 3 guys. You weren't cracking it more than that. This year, you kind of knew when you bring in those guys, you're going to throw the ball a little bit more. The ball's going to be more, and you have a third-year starting quarterback in Quinn Ewers. So then to get back to CJ's injury, CJ Baxter, number 1 running back recruit in class of 2023, suffers a torn ACL. He goes down. Then it looks like, all right, you're eventually going to lean even more into the pass. And that's what we saw, guys. This was a passing football team, especially in the early part of games for the first 5, 6, 7 games of the year. Mm-hmm. The run game, and I kind of went back and forth with Steve on this. They had a couple games, most notably, I want to say ULM was one. I think, they found enough yards in this mission with ULM. Louisiana Monroe was one. Mississippi State was another, where Steve, would look up and say, all right, hey, if I see 250 yards passing and 200 yards rushing, it's a good day. I'm not going to say the run game has issues. And my kind of what I'd push back with Steve on that was, hey, I understand you're getting 200 yards rushing, but anyone can do simple math. If I have 5 carries and, for 80 yards, and one of those carries is for 80, for 80 something, and you get the other 5 for 1, right? It doesn't mean you're an effective run team. It means you got a home run, right? Texas was relying too much, in my opinion, on the home run play. And not just the home run play, guys, home run play from non-running backs. Texas' 3 longest rushing plays this year are from non-running backs. Arch Manning, 67 yards against UTSA. Mm-hmm. Ryan Wingo, I can't remember what game that was his run. I want to say it was Michigan. And then Isaiah Bond. Those were the 3 longest runs of the year, right? So I was like, you're not really getting consistency in the run game. Quintraven Weisner kind of emerges because Jaden Blue, for as talented, and David, your point, you get him out on the edge, just a breakaway home run threat anytime he touches the ball, but has fumbling issues. I hadn't tracked it the past couple of weeks, but there was one point in which Jaden was averaging a fumble every 28-point-something attempts, right? Touches, excuse me. Obviously not a standard at the college level. So, he had some back-to-back fumbles in Mississippi State. Shipping in Mississippi State in the second half of that game that saw him bench. Quintrevin Weisner emerges, and he's kind of been the bell cow. And the run game has picked up, most notably back-to-back career days for Trey Weisner against Kentucky and Texas A&M. So I say all that to answer your question. The offense was definitely leaning on the pass more so, especially to kind of set up the run. Steve Sarkisian talked about it being leaned on his California roots. He would say, you go back and watch those old 49er teams with Bill Walsh and whatnot. They threw early to kind of set up the run. And that was kind of the way he was couching what I would say was just inefficiency in the run game, but being stronger in the pass. But now Steve kind of essentially admitted it and said, hey, we weren't running it as well as we'd have liked to. Things have started to pick up for us a little bit. And now they're looking a little bit more like the Texas team of 2023 that, while yes, still would throw the ball, especially, listen, the shallow pass game, the screen pass game, that's a huge part of this offense. It's something they use heavily. But you're also starting to see more of the run game as well. And it's not just that screen and shallow pass game in place of the run game.
What's really fascinating about just this matchup, we alluded to it earlier in the podcast, is these teams haven't met. There's not as much familiarity here, maybe aside the storyline between Kit Klubnik and yours in that state title game years ago. But what have you heard about what this team expects from this Tiger attack? Whether it's Sarkisian's reports or just your own study, what is the impression of what this Clemson team can bring to the table if they are to potentially secure an upset and compete against what Dave and I have talked throughout the year? At times, Texas, we thought they were the best team in the country and have shown that in spurts. Obviously, it's rotated through an Oregon or a Georgia or whatever your opinion may be. But what is the impression of this Clemson team heading into Saturday?
Yeah, I'll give you this. There's been three major talking points that we heard about today. One, you nailed it. The Austin kid, Cade Klubnik, coming back. Michael Taft, I believe was a teammate of Cade Klubnik. He talked extensively about those guys' relationship going back to COVID and how far back they go. So that certainly is a talking point that's been on all the Austin area guys, Jahdae Barron, Andrew Makuba, and Michael Taft, talking about kind of for Cade Klubnik, not only as a passer, but of course, dual threat, because Texas, and I will give the Longhorns credit, they performed well, not just this year, but over the past 2 years against dual threat quarterbacks. You can go all the way back to facing Jalen Milroe at Alabama last year, all the way through guys like Marcel Reed and Talon Green and Diego Pavia. They performed really well against dual threat quarterbacks. So I think the talking point has kind of been looking at Cade Klubnik, not necessarily through the lens of a Diego Pavia, because, no respect to Diego. I covered Diego back when I was covering Conference USA. No one's going to confuse Diego Pavia for Cade Klubnik as far as a passer, but really viewing him more through the lens of Michael Penix. That's the way that they're kind of approaching Cade Klubnik as far as the way they've talked about him. So that's step one. Step two, and forgive me, the running back's name, is it Mafa? How do you pronounce his last name?
Phil Maffa.
Phil Maffa. There was a lot of talk about him as far as being a downhill runner, right? Just being a little bit different. If you take a look at Texas, their defense, one of the, and I say this in air quotes, knocks against them, one of the talking points has been, they haven't faced a ton of potent offenses. And I would say, quite frankly, they've made those offenses not look very potent, quite frankly. They can't affect the fact that they didn't play LSU, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Alabama, some of those, Missouri, they didn't face those potent offenses in the SEC, but the offenses they have faced, they made them look, quite frankly, inadequate. They forced Carson Beck into, what is it now, 4 or 5 interceptions in 2 meetings, right? So it's not, and quite knocked Carson Beck, who I guess ended his year, is at least what we look like, right? So you can't fault Texas's defense in that regard, but especially as far as the running backs they performed. I think Clemson and the rushing game as a whole is going to be something really to keep an eye on. It's something that when we spoke with Texas defensive players, Anthony Hill, Jahdae Barron, Michael Taft, really eager to show that, hey, all right, we're going to face a top 15, top 16 team, and we think that we're capable of making them look like some of the other offenses we face. And the last thing, and this is, I think, is going to be a huge matchup, TJ Parker versus Kelvin Banks. Steve Sarkisian, very complimentary of Clemson's defensive line. Excuse me, of Clemson's defensive line. And the matchup I'm keeping my eye on is TJ Parker versus Kelvin Banks. I'd be excited about that as is, but especially with Kelvin coming off of that injury, you want to see how he's going to fare against one of the nation's elite pass rushers.
I'd love to quickly, David, I hate to cut you off, but you mentioned that comparison to Michael Penix. Could we potentially get any elaboration on just that comparison of what maybe they were seeing in film? I think that's truly fascinating because Penix, in my mind, was one of the best pure passers coming out of college last year, now landing with the Falcons. Did they provide any elaboration on that film study to make that specific comparison?
Yeah, where I think where they lean, knowing the guys, where they kind of land on Penix, is just the fact that, and Penix in comparison to Cade Klubnik, is just the fact that you take a look at some of the other dual threat. And I guess for your audience, let me put it in context. The question is asked, hey, how does Cade Klubnik compare to some of the other dual threats, right? And they just don't view him in the same lens as, again, a Talon Green, a Diego Pavia, Marcel Reed, Jalen Milroe going back to last year, they view him more in the lens of a Michael Penix, someone who I think, just knowing the guys the way I do, it's more of a testament to Cade Klubnik's passing ability. It's in that, hey, he is a supreme passer compared to any of those guys, while also having that ability as a runner. That's where, to kind of sum that up and put it in context, where I think that kind of lands.
I'm going to give this Texas defense an extreme compliment. They remind me so much of that 2018 Clemson defense that was dominant, filled with NFL players. And it all starts up front, but it's also that strong back end. And when I was going through the numbers, I was a little bit shocked, I guess, to see that the season high in total yardage of offense was 329 against Florida. 329. That is exceptional. And Florida only got 329 because Texas got out to the 35-0 lead and just kind of played a little bit soft. And, Florida was just, chipping away here and there. If it wouldn't have been for that, they're not going to get 329. What stands out about this Texas defense? And like I said, they're good at all three levels. But, boy, that secondary, the way that they cover, the way that they – press man, they dare guys to get by them at times, but mostly they play it in front of them. So they're like, we're not going to let you get behind us. They're great tacklers, and they're ball hawks.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you talk about, and you kind of talked about them being great at all three levels, that's the difference between this year's group and last year's group, which was really darn good in their own right. Last year's group was spearheaded by three guys: T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, and Jalen Ford, right? And not to say that the rest of the unit wasn't good. I'm a big Jahdae Barron fan. Someone, just won the Thorpe Award. Jahdae Barron has been an excellent cornerback for a while now. But you could just tell, right? Like, granted, okay, the pass rush, solid. You weren't going to do much up against the through the middle of this defense. But the secondary, they left a lot to be desired, especially as tacklers. They if you could get the ball in the hands of your receiver, it was 50-50 at best, whether the secondary, especially in the safety spots, were able to bring those guys down. You're going to get extra yardage. This year, it's everything is just completely flipped on its head. I'll start with kind of the front seven, right? Colin Simmons, as a true freshman, might be one of the more gifted pass rushers you will see. I mean, his first step, guys, phenomenal. So you have that to account for. Anthony Hill has really grown into that Mike linebacker spot where they play him at, in addition to still making plays behind the line of scrimmage as a pass rusher. I mentioned Jahdae Barron. Jahdae is someone who played nickel slot corner for the majority of his career. He decides to come back and make the move outside, right? So what that did is it did a lot for Texas secondary. One, it allowed for them to get Jalen Gilbo on the field, who is someone who just as a talent is someone who he had suffered a knee injury in 2022, wasn't really himself in 2023, even though he was back. To be able to get him on the field at star, a spot that he really can only, or I shouldn't say only, but kind of exclusively plays, that helped. Secondly, Jahdae's ability as a run defender helped really replace Ryan Watts, who went to the NFL now with the Pittsburgh Steelers. His ability in the run fit from that boundary spot was huge, and then also Jahdae's coverage ability. Then you get Andrew Makuba, and again, if you ask any of the Texas defenders, they'll tell you that was the missing piece. And this is no disrespect to Jaron Thompson, who had a really good year this year at Auburn. For whatever reason, Jaron's 2022 and 2024 outstanding as a tackler. 2023, it looked like he had no interest in tackling. I'm not sure, maybe if it was the fact he was, maybe a little frustrated being part of a safety rotation with a 4-5 player safety rotation as opposed to in 2022, he was kind of the primary one of two safeties back there. I don't know. But Andrew Makuba's made all the difference. We heard so many times when Texas's defense, for your audience, they ranked 12th in passing yards allowed in the Big 12 last year. So many times it was, the communication was off. This was off. We weren't, we were on the same page. You don't hear that. And I do think part of that is the 5-1-2 connection. Makuba, Taff, and Barron, guys who trained together in the offseason, have trained together for years, them having that connection, but also just improved play in the secondary. So to your point, David, across all three levels, it's an 11-man unit as opposed to last year where it was really three guys and everyone else kind of hanging on.
Yeah, the way you lay it out, it's Texas. I mean, the numbers do speak for itself there, Eric, with just how dominant they've been. You mentioned how they've shut down some pretty potent offenses in 2024. I'd love to play devil's advocate here and just talk about not with the Texas defense per se, but just when you look at sort of Texas's overall body of work, and then you just take into account the things we've talked about through this entire podcast, where would Clemson fans maybe need to look for to say these flaws of Texas need to show up in order for Clemson to pull off the upset? Because, yes, they are a double-digit dog here going into Austin. So Vegas does think that Texas is the better team by a large margin here. So what do the Tigers need to maybe look out for, maybe study for in your evaluation to say, hey, if Texas does this, this, and that, they're not going to the Peach Bowl on New Year's Day?
Oh, listen, I do think Texas wins this game. However, there's a formula. There's a route for Clemson to win this game, and it's something that Texas has struggled with all year. Let's start with turnovers. Texas, when I check, I believe they're 122nd in the nation in turnovers forced. I know they've committed 22 turnovers this year on offense. Obviously, that plays into Clemson's hand. They forced 25 turnovers this year. That's step one, right? And as I talked about, Jaden Blue struggled with fumbles. There was one point in which all three running backs fumbled in the same game: Blue, Wisner, and Jarrett Gibson. That's one. Quinn Ewers has been uncharacteristically, I don't want to say reckless, but bad. Quinn Ewers is someone who had back-to-back years of only throwing 6 interceptions. This year, I'm not sure where Quinn's at now, but he's turned the ball over way too much, whether it's combined interceptions and fumbles. So there's that aspect of that. So there is a route. Here's another one. Texas is committed, and again, I'm not sure where they're at now. I usually check these numbers on Tuesday. But there's one point in the year where Texas, I want to say it was entering the Texas A&M game, where they'd committed 50 penalties. 39 of them were on offense, and 31 of them were pre-snap penalties, false starts. Grayson, a lot of those penalties were at home. That was the mind-boggling thing. Right tackle Cam Williams at one point led the nation in penalties assessed to an offensive lineman. That plays into Clemson's hand as well. Because guess what? If you're going to get behind the chains, I'll take my chances with TJ Parker on that Clemson defensive front. If we're going to get into, first and 10 goes to the first and 15, or second and 4 turns into second and 9, I'll take my chances and give the ball back to Cade Klubnik and company. And the third thing is if Clemson can win the field position game, that's what helped Georgia win the first go around. Georgia scored 30 points. I'm here to tell you right now, that wasn't Texas's defense. You take a look at the first 23 points scored. I used to be able to run this off the top of my head. I can't right now, but all those scoring drives, they were 44 yards or less. And they had like 3 scoring drives that went 4 plays, 4 yards, 4 plays, 7 yards, right? That was Texas's offense handing Georgia's offense short fields. If Clemson can get and win the field position battle, trust me, there is a route. Again, I do think Texas wins this game, but 2 things can be true. I think Texas wins this game, but there also is a very clear route, a very clear avenue, a very clear path for Clemson to come in here and pull off the upset.
Yeah, and that path for sure. I think the way I look at it, I think Texas does win this football game, but there is also a route where I would go if Clemson were to win at the end of the day. I go, oh, okay. Like there's something there to that. David, as you're back, and maybe anything you want to add before we wrap up off this preview with Eric. Eric, you did a fantastic job, by the way.
We haven't hit the most important part of all of this, the most important part for any Clemson fan traveling to Austin. Barbecue Tex-Mex. Where are the 2 go-to?
Yeah, David, you break it a little bit, but I got the gist of your question, which is barbecue and Tex-Mex. So here's the thing, all right? I like to have a little fun with this, and this hasn't endeared me to the folks here in Texas, all right? But if you know anything about Texas barbecue, it's primarily beef, okay? So for those of you who love the swine, you're going to be a little hard pressed to find it. You can find it, but it can be a little hard pressed. Now, the go-to staple in Austin is Terry Black's. That's the spot. All right, that's the spot where everyone comes in. The line is going to be a little long, especially this time of year, right? But Terry Black's, I would definitely recommend. I will say there's a much better spot up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but Austin folks, don't shoot the messenger.
No.
If Clemson fans are ever in Dallas-Fort Worth and able to get out to Frisco, there's a spot called Hutchins. That is the best barbecue I've had out there. I've had that and then Kansas City barbecue. But anyhow, to your question, Terry Black's best in Austin by far. Now, as far as Tex-Mex, the local staple is Matt's El Rancho. That is the spot. Funny enough, tight end Amari Nyblack, when he transferred in from Alabama, he was adamant that the spot that sold him was going to Matt's El Rancho. So if it's good enough for Amari, it should be good enough for folks. But it's a good spot. And you listen, it's Austin. I will say, for what I said about barbecue, the complete opposite. You can't go wrong. If you're a Clemson fan, you're coming in, and I will say this, I mean this sincerely. There are a couple little food trucks right if you leave Austin Bergstrom International Airport. I mean, right as you come off, there's frontage road that you have to take to get on to that 45 to head into downtown. If you catch any of those little food trucks, stop there, because some of the best Mexican you'll find will hit those spots as well.
All right. Looks like we got the recommendations from Mr. Eric Henry of Horns247. Eric, where can they find you? Either our Clemson fans want to give you your thanks for the barbecue recommendations or just anything else. Where can they find you? On Twitter?
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at @EricCHenry_. You can, of course, find my Texas football coverage, which for this week, we'll have plenty of coverage between ourselves and Clemson. So, stop by for some nuggets there at horns247.com, 247sports.com. Let's see where else. Texas Sports Unfiltered. I do a daily show, 12 to 1, Monday through Fridays. And if you happen to be around on Sunday, you can catch me in halftime of the late football game. Myself and Corey Mose on the ABC affiliate KView. We do a halftime segment talking Texas football as well.
Well, how about that? We'll have plenty of that and more. Eric, we want to thank you for your time doing some coverage here, previewing Clemson and Texas. This should be a fun one in this new expanded playoff. Guys, thank you as always for tuning into this podcast, and thank you to our sponsors for making this possible. If you're traveling to Austin, be safe and get some barbecue. Thank you guys, and take care.